Hello and welcome back to Spy Hard's podcast. I'm Agent Scott.
And I'm Cam the Provocateur.
And we are here continuing our journey into the Quantum of Solace. First of our two interviews, though we have a third interview not connected with the film next week as well. Cam, who do we have up first?
Yes, we are here this week to talk to actor Rufus Wright, who appears as a treasury agent in a memorable scene in Quantum of Solace, but also has several other spy credits, including movies like, Spy Game, Rogue One, just some obscure ones here and there.
Yeah, and Operation Mincemeat, which came out recently that I'm a big fan of. So without further ado, Cam, roll the interview. And joining us now on the show, one of the stars of this week's film, Quantum of Solace, it is Mr. Rufus Wright. Hello, sir. How are you doing?
I'm fine, thank you. How are you?
I'm not so much enjoying this British weather we're having at the moment. It's getting quite cold out, but I'm
It's
sure
biblical out there most days, isn't it? Yeah, absolutely brutal. I was in Disneyland Paris the other day, and I will never forget the sight of watching some people on one of those rides which slowly revolves around a central axis, when you're going slowly up and down.
Mm-hmm.
And so a driving rainstorm started, and they were in these little kind of miniature spaceships, just kind of absolutely battered with rain. And it was poor things. They were obviously having the worst time of their lives, but never mind.
I think it'd be the cheerful song that's playing whilst they're being drowned that would really put me off.
There's a lot of piped music in Disneyland, a lot. You can't go anywhere without a speaker in a bush playing a kind of jaunty tune. And that exactly when the driving rain is forcing itself between your eyelids, it's pretty horrific.
Well, we're focusing on Quantum of Solace this week, and you pop up as a treasury agent in the film, and I want to dig into that a little bit, but let's just sort of set the table a wee bit before we get there. Because you've got quite the spy credentials in your filmography. There's quite a lot of films there that you've popped into recently. Operation Mincemeat, all the way back to Spy Game, one of our favorite films as well. Tons to discuss. But all before that, Rufus, what made you want to get into acting in the first place?
I, like a lot of the actors I'm sure you speak to, I sort of got into it when I was a teenager. It wasn't so much school as a club that my dad used to work at, a very posh kind of members club called the Hurlingham Club in Fulham. My dad was like a high-ranking... Oh, you know the Hurlingham? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So my dad was a major general in the British Army. He was a very high-ranking soldier and had a kind of 40-year career starting literally in the 1940s, straight after the war. Through to the early 1980s. He retired as Major General in 85, and then he started working at the Hurlingham Club, ran it. And I got free membership, and as a posh South London club, the drama activities for kids were fantastic. And we had, a decent budget, and we used to do things like Godspell and Joseph and Jesus Christ Superstar, stuff like that. So that's when I first started doing kind of proper plays and getting leading roles and all of that. And it's a very enticing feeling for a teenager to have a bunch of adults in the palm of his hand, or her hand, and it's a very invigorating and addictive feeling. So I started getting bigger roles, and then a couple of roles at school and stuff. But it was really those plays when I was about 13, 14 that made me think, oh, hang on, this is an exhilarating feeling. And some of the grown-ups would say at the end, oh, you're very good at this. You should think about doing this for a living. And my dad, of course, was not particularly in favor of me doing it. Although he completely changed and was the most supportive and wonderful, wonderful man. He died, unfortunately, 10 years ago, but he was incredibly supportive and kind, and came to see everything I was in and talked about me constantly to his friends. So it all sort of changed. But it was by no means, it's not an easy career. And Spy Game, which we'll talk about in a bit, was my first movie in 2001. Even then I'd been acting for, I guess, four or 5 years by that stage. And it wasn't my first filming job, but it was my first film per se. And it's kind of continued from there, I guess.
What would you say, because acting, as you said, it's a difficult profession. What was the first moment that kind of gave you confidence that this could be a profession?
In a way, it was the first paycheck. I remember people would say to me, "Oh, your parents will be very suspicious and down on you being an actor until they see you on TV." And then they'll tell their friends, and then everything sort of changes. So it was partly that. It was partly the first play I did, which was in 1997. It was a production of Richard II. And it was literally I think we were paid in cash, and it was something like £100 a week or £200 a week, but it was getting that envelope of cash in it. And it was partly the first commercial I did, which was for a mobile phone shop. And I got, 10 or 20,000 pounds for that in about 2000 or 2001. So all of those, I suppose those are all financial moments. But, as you know, being an actor is so much about struggling to pay the bills and get to the next rent check. So in purely pragmatic terms, it was those kind of little landmarks of being rewarded and being paid for doing the work. But in terms of just the value of the work and like, this is great and I can feel myself doing this. I did a play called The Back Room in 1998 that was set in I was a rent boy. Had a great cast. It was in a small London theatre called the Pleasance Theatre. But that was the first time I thought, oh, this is new writing. I'm playing a part that's very out of my comfort zone, and people are on their feet, and it's getting a great reception. So I think that was probably the first time I got excited about being an actor. And then I think in filming terms, it was probably Spy Game, actually.
Well, I think before we chart the waters of Spy Game and Bond, I suppose, as well, James Bond, how was that for you? I mean, you're British, I'm British. Mm-hmm. It's kind of, we're brought up on it most of the time, but for you, was it a big part of your upbringing?
It was, yeah. I think for all of us, Scott, English people, I guess, or British people growing up, Bond has a certain sort of cachet, and you're encouraged to sort of identify or not with Bond. In fact, I've just started reading a very interesting book that I'm sure you would enjoy by Simon Winder about Bond and the myth of Bond kind of created post-war, and how it sort of answered a lot of questions that were left. I can't remember the name of the book now, stupidly, but it's a brilliant, very funny book. And it's sort of, it looks at the history of Britain in the First and Second World Wars and how Bond was Fleming's sort of answer to the British crisis of identity after the Second World War. Anyway, so I'd always enjoyed Bond. I'm not an absolute expert or fanatic, which I think is probably helpful when you're in a Bond movie, because otherwise you just turn to jelly. I certainly grew up. I mean, I was born in 1974, so I was sort of, Roger Moore was my Bond, and I sort of grew up going to a couple of the movies. I remember, when was Moonraker? Was that about 1977 or 1978?
1979.
1979 was it? Okay, I think that was the first one I saw in the cinema, although I was only 5, so that probably doesn't sound right, actually. But yeah, I was always a big fan, and then I loved Pierce Brosnan, and then the Daniel Craig movies really excited me, as they did all of us, right? It was a complete revolution. It was like what Tony Blair did to the Labour Party. It was like, we can do this with this franchise. We could totally revolutionize it. And so I was thrilled when I was able to be a very small part of the universe,
And how did the details go in terms of getting that job?
It was one quick meeting with Debbie McWilliams, who I think is still casting the Bond movies.
I believe so.
And it was somewhere glamorous, like I think it was in Piccadilly, like the Athenaeum Club or somewhere like that. It was a rather glamorous location. And this is 2008, so it was sort of pre the manic NDA sort of hysteria, actually, around movie projects nowadays, in which you're not sent a copy of, we'll talk about Rogue One later, but in which you're never sent a copy of the entire script. All the pages are watermarked to an absurd degree. You can't discuss the project with anybody you've ever met, all that sort of thing. So Quantum of Solace was actually quite a simple look. Here's the scene. And I went along and read it, I think once. And they said, thanks very much. And then I think it was a day or two later, I got the call saying I had the job. And I was absolutely thrilled. And I was absurdly thrilled that they sent me things with kind of 007 compliment slips. And, I used to collect the little bits of stationery that were included in the envelopes. I thought that was just absolutely amazing.
Well, so one of the things we've charted with some of the interviews for Quantum of Solace is its troubled upbringing is quite well documented now. Obviously the writer's strike really hindered the film.
Mm.
Was that something you got a sense of with the production, or was the scene ready by the time you got it, and that's what you shot?
No, I think we were aware of it was called Bond 22, kind of on all the call sheets and everything. And yeah, we were aware of the kind of wobbles around production. And I don't think I was given much new to do, but there was an actor called Brendan O'Hay who's in the scene with us in that treasury scene. He's wearing a sort of tweed jacket,
yeah,
and he starts briefing Judy on the developments in the case. And he was given an entirely new set of lines to learn, God love him, and really struggled with it. He was actually friends with Judy. He knows Judi Dench quite well socially. But he fluffed his lines a couple of times, and we got terrible, terrible giggles in that absurd, stupid actor way of corpsing, which is so hard to describe. Have either of you done any acting or not?
I haven't done acting, but I know what you mean of like the just giggles that will not stop. Yeah.
Yeah, it's so hard to articulate. In fact, the best description of it was Ricky Gervais and Steve Merchant on the extras of Extras, which I also had a small part in. But Steve talks about how frustrated he would get with Ricky corpsing on The Office. I was like, look, we're against the clock here. And then he said when he played that character Darren Lamb in Extras, he sort of had moments where he couldn't stop laughing, and he realized that corpsing is sort of a whole cavalcade of human emotions all happening at the same time. It's not really laughing. It's not that. It's kind of absolute hysteria. It's like laughing at a funeral. It's the only kind of comparable thing. That something gets, as the coffin's getting lowered into the ground, something amusing happens, and you and your sister or your mother suddenly start shaking with laughter, and it's the most inappropriate thing in the world. And I remember being on the set, the Bond soundstage, with 30 or 40 crew members standing around, and Brendan fluffed a line, and Judy and Rory Kinnear and me. Daniel wasn't on set by that time. He'd shot his stuff and he was out, but the rest of us were just shoulders kind of shaking with laughter. And it was so inappropriate and so ridiculous. But that's one of my abiding memories of filming, actually, is not being able to stop laughing.
I would have to imagine, though, even if it's maybe not what the director and the crew is wanting in that moment, that it has to bond the cast together a bit.
Yeah, it does. It does. And particularly when you're working with legends, with Dame Judy and with Dan. Yeah, it does. But Mark Forster was a nice enough guy. He didn't give me, I think, a single word of direction the whole day, and was, I don't think he particularly saw the funny side of it. I think if you're a director dealing with actors corpsing, you need to sort of meet it head on and not just kind of tell them off, because that makes it worse, of course. But just kind of laugh along and show a bit of sympathy and say, all right, let's have another go at it, rather than, yeah. It's tricky.
Well, you mentioned, speaking to Mark Forster's point, he had a lot of pressure with this film because he hadn't really done that kind of film before. It was a massive weight doing a Bond film. So I can see why he just wanted to get on with it. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
But you mentioned like the legends that you're standing next to. Dan was there. Dame Judy is there. You've done some films by this point. You've done some TV work as well, just looking at your filmography. But how was that room? I mean, that's Dame Judy right there. How is that dealing with that sort of pressure? That's
right. Well, I was nervous about meeting Dan. Of course, he was absolutely charming, really, really sweet. They shot his stuff quite early, and he was sort of apologetically sort of left the room and was called off to do some fight stunt work rehearsal. And I couldn't really work out why. And then a friend pointed out, well, Bond is never in soft focus. He's never in the back of anyone else's shot. I thought, yeah, of course, that makes sense. You're never going to have Bond. You're never going to be focused on me, but have Bond in the background type thing. So that's why he's gone. But he was absolutely charming. And Judy, I sort of had the feeling I would like, because she's legendarily such a nice person. And also she came up in theatre, and I think theatre actors kind of sniff each other out a bit. And most big British movie stars, apart from, there are some like Colin Firth, and there are some who've got little theatre experience, but most people do have some theatre experience, and you kind of, there's a sort of unspoken language between you, which you know, there's a camaraderie or something. And Rory Kinnear I know very well anyway. He and I are close friends. We did a play together in about 2005. And Brendan, as I say, I'd met before. So yeah, so it was a nice atmosphere in the room, actually. Also, I do card magic, and I always have a deck of cards with me on a movie set. So I ended up doing some card tricks for Judy, which she enjoyed so much that she invited me to join her when she was getting ready for the premiere of Quantum of Solace at some posh hotel in Covent Garden. And I did some card tricks for her grandson.
I wish I'd known this now. I would have asked you to brought a deck with you and you could do a trick. Save it for Dame Judy, I say.
Yeah.
She deserves it. But another thing jumped out to me. I went back and watched the scene today. Is you have this magical wizard digital table in front of you. That's, I have to imagine all of that's post-production, but how was it navigating that?
Yeah, it was actually quite complicated. It was it's the coolest gadget in the movie. Like that's the takeaway from the scene, and that's what I'm proud of. It was like an enormous overhead projector. It was just a light box, you know. It was a white light box. But I was called in to rehearse the scene the day before, and the kind of tech guy gave me a piece of sort of acetate with a little single dot in one corner, and said, "Right, so you're going to start here. You're going to tap it, and then spin it around with your thumb, and then you move to this point." And he drew a little kind of diagram for me. And I remember going home that day and clearing off the dining room table and using a piece of A4 paper, just kind of grabbing it, and you know, and the account was deposited here, and money's gone here, and then this account here, and practicing. I must have practiced about 40 or 50 times because I knew that on the day I would just have to be incredibly slick. Yeah, so on the day there was nothing, it was just light, and then it all came in obviously in post.
And I would love to know, in the scene, it's primarily an exposition scene, right? Where you have to explain essentially how they're going to get to the next phase of the plot. As an actor, exposition can be like crushing. How do you communicate that in a way where the audience is sitting forward as opposed to, you know, kind of like, okay, yeah, here we go? Because I think you genuinely pull it off.
Oh, that's very kind. I mean, me and a lot of actors who do the same sort of work as me sometimes call ourselves kind of exposition in trousers, you know. And there's a lot of ways that filmmakers get exposition. I mean, you'll be familiar with this as key moviegoers and critics, but you know, the number of American cop shows where they go to a lap dancing bar and there's two girls lap dancing, just to give the audience something. It sounds awful, but give them something to look at. While the two cops go, "So tell me again, Eddie went back to the bar and he didn't know." "Yeah, no, he gave the money to the guy." And there's these girls kind of winding away with snakes in the background so that you've got something to look at. So when I do a lot of kind of exposition in trousers kind of acting. It's just a question of sort of knowing what your job is. In a way, your job is to be invisible. Do you know what I mean? In a way, if you suddenly think, "Oh, I've got a great idea. I'm going to do the whole thing with a lisp, or I'm going to limp, or I'm going to give this character some sort of backstory." It's like, nah, nobody cares about this character. Your job is purely to get the information across as efficiently as you can. The camera's probably going to be on the other guy anyway, so just do your job, you know. And I think as an actor, a lot of the time, you have to know when to leave your ego at the door. And I think if you're doing a part like this, you think, yeah, no one cares. No one, you know, this is not a Mike Leigh movie where you need to know the backstory and what this guy's parents are called and what his childhood was like. You've just got to get that information across as efficiently and as clearly as possible. And you're probably going to have to do it 60 times. So don't get too bored of it, you know.
And how important is it when you're going through like exposition to have an actor like you have, you know, Dame Judi Dench here to play off of when you're actually delivering that information?
Oh, I think it's important, and a decent actor will give you an eye line off camera, even when it's not their bit, you know. And you can always tell the actors who are a little bit too grand, because they'll do their bits first, and then when it's your turn to do your bit, they'll find an excuse to go back to the trailer, and you'll end up doing it to a stand-in. But it's very rare that you hear those stories, and actually actors will exchange stories about film stars who've done that and haven't done that. You know, it's like, oh, I worked with Sean Connery, and you know, couldn't believe it. You know, it was my close-up, and he was off camera, and he you know, he was there for me the whole time. Oh God, I worked with, I can't think of anyone now, but someone who just said, "Oh yeah," looked at the watch and said, "I'm off now, bye." And suddenly you're doing it to some guy with a headset on and a bobble hat or something, and you think, well, this is not helpful. So yeah, when the stakes are high, it's really nice to have the person that you're delivering the information to right there for you.
Back into sort of Quantum as well, one of the questions I had was just sort of looking at. We spoke about sort of the troubled production of the film and the script being in flux. And since this film, Daniel Craig has come out and said that he wrote lines for the film whilst on set. Now, I'm not saying you came up with some of your dialogue because it's actually quite exposition heavy. But was there any sense that you could change some of this, just the the's and the ands and have any sort of input, or was it literally to script?
I think had there been something I felt it could have been rephrased, and I've done this, I think, on a couple of other films. I'd maybe just take the director to one side way before we started shooting and just saying, look, I think it'd be better if I said it like this. Or it does make you think, I've had conversations with other actors who've ended up adding lines to quite big movies. And, getting a film made, as we know, takes years, and getting a script particularly through a studio with a big franchise like Bond, is just such a complicated process. So how it can land on the set with a kind of gaping error in it, or a hole in it, or something that grammatically just doesn't sort of work, it just frustrates me. It really confuses me. There was, as you say, my stuff was very expositional. There was no need for me to really tweak anything. And I would have felt I wouldn't have been high status enough to probably suggest something unless it was sort of really obvious. So yeah, no, I didn't add nothing.
Well, one thing I wanted to ask about, because obviously your character is billed as treasury agent. You haven't got a name.
No.
Did you ever add a name in your head to the character? Did you give yourself that?
No. Something that they do that Lucasfilm always do is to very generously give all their actors character names, or 95% of them. So my one line in Rogue One, which was a lot more, we shot a lot more, but I ended up as Lieutenant Casido, and that's my name, and that's when I go to conventions, I get to say, yes, I played Lieutenant Casido in Rogue One, and thank you very much, Lucasfilm. It's very kind of them to do that. It wouldn't have taken much to call the Treasury agent John Smith, or something. It could have had a name. Something that some friends of mine do is I've got quite a successful friend who played a character where there was a London doctor and a New York doctor, and he was just down as London doctor. So he switched it to Dr. London.
Brilliant.
On IMDb, he's Dr. London. Thanks very much. Yeah, that was my name in that. And I think he played someone called Male Nurse, and he changed that to Guy Nurse. Yeah, I'm just that's my name. It's Guy Nurse. It's like, if you can get away with it, fair enough.
Does that mean we're going to make you Mr. Treasure?
Yeah, maybe. What could I come up with? Trevor Agent. No, something. I'll come up with something.
Trevor Treasure. Go for alliterative. That's there you go. A very strange name, but it's catchy.
Well, I was curious because the exposition is very intentional in what it has to get across in that scene. But was there anything that was cut along the way, or did the scene play longer when you were filming it?
No, I think it all ended up in place, actually. And there was a quite cool overhead shot which they did. I remember them setting up the camera directly above us. In fact, it was a run at the scene in which we were giggling like idiots and corpsing. And but I did all sorts of the big hand movements across the table. I think they ended up in the trailer. There's a kind of little shot of all that stuff. And I should say, actually, that the movie itself has a pretty bad reputation amongst Bond fans, and I'm friends with a man called John Rain, who does the Smirsh Pod podcast that you may have come across. Mm-hmm. And he's incredibly rude about Quantum of Solace. I mean, he's a real Bond expert, but he is unremittingly rude about Quantum. And we sort of joke about it because I don't know enough about the Bond movies to kind of contrast it. So, I mean, there are some clearly other very bad Bond movies, but I think Quantum of Solace is unfairly maligned. And having gone back to, I suppose I've watched it maybe 2 or 3 times in my life. I should probably go back to it again. My son's 11 and I'm sort of introducing him to Bond, so I might watch it with him sometime soon. But I think it's unfairly maligned, and there are some set pieces in it. The bit in the opera house where they're all listening, having the meeting on their headsets, and there's an assassin, all that sort of thing. I think that's an extraordinary scene. I think it's brilliant. And a couple of the fight scenes that they're very kind of Bourne movie, inspired clearly by Bourne. But I think there are some really good moments in it, and I think it is slightly unfairly maligned, I have to say.
Well, it's one of the ones that's had the most reappraisals over the years.
Yes.
Where it really does feel like there's a real group out there championing Quantum. And I think Scott and I recorded our review for the film, and we both found a lot to love in it. Like, it may be not as, confident out of the gate as, say, like Casino Royale, the 2 years before, but there's a lot to love in Quantum of Solace, and I think that's why it's getting more and more visits. And if you go back to the Blu-ray, I would like you to note that your hands are one of the chapter stop images.
Well, that's something for the great, isn't it?
That's right. That's right.
I think it's like an incredibly bad title, and I think when they announced the title Quantum of Solace, there was that very funny Adam and Joe parody where they kind of sang the songs in which they couldn't Swantum, the something of Boris, the Swantum of Qualis, terrible title. There's no doubt about it. But then as you get used to it, 10, 15 years pass and it's just Quantum and you kind of forget how bad a title it is, if you see what I mean. And also the opening song by Jack White and Alicia Keys. First time you hear it, you're like, that's not a very good song. But I've heard that song so many times. It's now on my kind of one of my playlists I listen to regularly. And I love it. It's a great Bond theme. And Jack White is an incredible musician. And he plays the hell out of that Rickenbacker and plays those Bond chords. And it's a great track. But on first listen, it's like,
Well, tying it into what you mentioned about sort of Star Wars and the conventions you've been to, the legacy of being in a Bond film. We had Joseph Milson on recently talking about Casino Royale and his sort of brief time in that and his legacy in going to conventions and doing that sort of thing afterwards. What have you found post-Quantum? Obviously, you mentioned a Smirch Pod there. Obviously, you're talking to us about it today. But have you found that the film keeps coming up for you since?
Yeah, in a way. It's quite a small group of us who've been in Bond and Star Wars, I've realized. There was a kind of Twitter thing about it the other day. It was like, oh, who's been in both? And I mean, I've had a tiny part in both, really, but there aren't many actors who've done big parts in both. And to be honest, when I've only done a few conventions, and I did them sort of when Rogue One came out in about 2016, and maybe the year after, and there was quite a lot of heat around it because everybody enjoyed it so much as a movie. So most of the people I've kind of encountered at conventions have been Star Wars fans rather than Bond fans. But I think as Cam was saying, there's a real affection for Quantum of Solace, and it gets reappraised quite a lot. And I'd be very interested to see down the line in 10 years' time how we look at it in comparison to. I mean, it'll never be as good as Casino Royale or possibly Skyfall, but Spectre was the other one that people, the other Daniel Craig film that people didn't like very much. And I wonder how it'll be viewed alongside.
I don't think the dust has really settled on No Time to Die just yet. I think people have quite decided whether they liked that ending or not. So maybe, in a couple of years' time, they'll go, actually, Quantum. Hey.
Yeah, you're right, yeah.
But moving on from Quantum, we sort of skipped over you mentioned it earlier, your first sort of major motion picture, which was Spy Game, a film that me and Cam love very much. How did you get connected with that film?
Yeah, that was, 2001. And Lucinda Syson was casting it and got me in to read. And then I went in the following week and met Tony Scott. I think it was 1 or 2 or maybe 3 days, but in Shepperton, I think. I'm working with Bob Redford. I mean, my God, that was amazing. He was charming. He was kind. I was very nervous, and I was playing an American. There was a dialect coach helping me with that, but dialect coaches can be quite on you, and she would kind of scuttle up to me at the end of each take and kind of give me some advice or whisper things, and it becomes off-putting at a certain point, and you get quite anxious. But Bob was absolutely charming. Tony Scott was, he was very nice, but he had that kind of that sort of chippy thing that sometimes he's from Newcastle or South Shields, I think. And he was like, he'd say, all right, we're going again because Rufus messed it up. All right, come on. And he gave me a wink. And I go, and I I realized that he thrived on being, if I spoke back to him, it's like, well, shut up, Tony. If you hadn't told me this, I wouldn't have done it. It's like, oh, all right, not bad. He can give as good as he can get, that sort of thing. And I never get on well with people like that because I'm far too nice and polite. I couldn't give it both barrels to Tony Scott in front of everybody else. Yeah, I was very nervous, but Bob really put me at ease, and all my stuff was with him, really. And I'm so glad you guys liked the movie. I think it's one of those movies. When I did a play a few years afterwards, and someone came to see it who'd served with special forces, and in fact, he's one of the coolest guys I'd ever met. I think he was in the SAS. He'd left the SAS and he'd gone into hostage negotiation in South America. So he was the guy that would speak to the head of the drug cartel in order to get them to release the ambassador's daughter. He's Jack Bauer, basically.
Yeah.
And when he didn't do that, to unwind, he'd just work as a gaucho in Argentina. So he was just a sort of cowboy. So when he wasn't being Jack Bauer, he was being a cowboy. And I was like, you're the coolest guy I've ever met. And he was like, yeah, but you were in Spy Game. Tell me about Spy Game. And I was like, well, did a couple of days at Shepperton and I was 26 and it was really good fun. But tell me more about being a hostage negotiator in South American drug cartels. It was like, no, I want to talk about Spy Game. And we did that thing that people often do with actors, which is sort of getting a bit overexcited about what ended up being a day's work 20 years ago, and he's got a far more interesting life, but he wants to talk about my life and I want to talk about his. So, that's the way it goes. But I think Spy Game's a great movie, and I'm thrilled that you guys like it so much because I think it's terrific.
Yeah, definitely. And I would love to know, you talk about Tony Scott as like a personality, but he's someone who, like, in the years kind of really following his death, has been reappraised as like one of the great visionary directors of his time. I would just like to know, from a process point of view, what it was like being directed by him.
Yeah, I think he's been unfairly overshadowed by his brother. I mean, who, let's face it, has made some bad movies, as well as, of course, the good movies he's made are far better than Tony Scott's best movies, Blade Runner and Alien and so on. But like Prometheus or whatever, they're not all hits. They're not all great movies. And Tony was never the visionary his brother was. He was much more of a kind of workhorse of a director, but a great storyteller. And yeah, I can't remember very much of my time on set. I mean, again, it wasn't quite exposition in trousers, but it wasn't far off. In fact, I was the other one of my other archetypes, which is a friend of mine says he always plays unsuspecting husbands in things, and I was almost that. I'm like kind of. I played a lot of hapless bureaucrats, guys who are kind of pushing pens around while something much more interesting happens in the background, and then they're sort of unaware of it. And that beat is what the movie needs to move on. Some guy who gets easily fooled. So I've played a few of those. No, I can't remember much about Tony's process, but I remember him being a kind of a pretty affable guy, I guess.
Well, you mentioned that you needed a dialect coach, but you just took me back to Auf Wiedersehen Pet there with Tony Scott accent. That was that felt very very natural there. That was very well done.
Thank you. I'm very good at I've always been quite good at accents, which used to be incredibly useful. It's less so now, because if they're going to cast an Irish guy, they want an Irish guy, they're going to get an Irish guy rather than the guy who could do a good Irish accent. So it's useful in certain circumstances, but not as much as it used to be.
Well, the question I had sort of left for Spy Game is, you mentioned Bob Redford, Tony Scott, you're there, but this is your first major motion picture. Is there anything you did to sort of pick their brains? Did you take a moment to try and talk to those sort of leaders of the film industry around you? Were you just sort of there and just taking it in?
Yeah, I was standing next to Bob and trying to think of something interesting to say. I remember it was a classic example of seeing how a big budget movie works, because we were standing in Larry Brigman was the actor who was my boss in the movie. I think he's the head of the CIA. And Bob had a scene with Larry where he would say, do you remember when all this used to mean something? All of this? And he gestures around the room. And he took Tony to one side. Bob Redford took Tony Scott to one side. It was like, because there were pictures of like racehorses along the walls, because it was a posh paneled office. And he was saying, Tony, do you think we could have something else? Could the art guys do something? Because I kind of say, do you remember when all this used to mean something? All of this, and if I'm gesturing and we're seeing the room, it'd be nice to have something else. And I swear, within 15 minutes, every framed picture of a racehorse or a whatever it was replaced with ex-presidents and an American flag and you know, something else. And suddenly the room felt different. And the art department, you know, on movies like that can just, in 15 minutes, they will totally redress a room. And Tony was like, Bob's that better? And Bob looked, yeah, I'll do. That's cool. That's great. And then we shot the scene, you know. So it's just one of those things that, and I just remember watching it with my eyes on stalks, thinking, wow, this is the movie, this is the world we're in now, you know, where stuff like this just happens. And also, I suppose I learned something I have learned as an actor is that there are certain choices that you need to make sometimes as an actor to make the environment around you suit you a little bit better, that aren't about you being difficult. They're about you trying to make the story clearer. And sometimes you feel a bit, I did an episode of Outlander a few years ago, and I had to arrest Sam Heughan's character and give someone else a bag of money for betraying him, basically. And I didn't have any, sounds really trivial, but I didn't have any pockets in my costume. So I had to come on with this bag of money in my hand like an idiot. And then handing the money over is meant to be a big reveal at the end of the scene, like this woman or this man has betrayed him and this woman has betrayed him, and I'm paying her. And I said, you know, is there any way I can conceal this money? Otherwise I'm walking on with the money in my hand. And they were like, yeah, well, you haven't got any pockets, so that's tough. And I was like, well, could someone fix this? And they were like, well, not really, because you haven't got any pockets. I was like, no, can someone fix this? Can someone fix this so that this isn't a problem for me and a problem for the story? And I had to slightly kind of pull rank, and then I could see them going, oh. And 15 minutes later, I had a little hook on the bag and a little button inside my coat, and I was able to conceal this bag. And this sounds like a trivial story, but it was just an example of, as an actor, realizing I've got a bit of agency here, and I'm not number one on the call sheet, but I'm trying to help the story be a little bit better here, and I need you to help me on this, and I'm going to slightly insist on it because that's what needs to happen right now in this performance. This, you know, this just needs to, we need to step up a little bit, and I need to slightly push in order to make that happen. So I suppose watching Bob make this decision about what paintings we have hanging in the panel office made me just planting a seed to think, oh, yeah, it's okay to kind of flag up something you think might be a problem, but always got to know I guess you've always got to know your place. And if you start, there's nothing more embarrassing than watching a young actor approach a director and go, why don't we do it like this? And you're going, no, not your job, know your place, you know.
Well, I mean, we had the cinematographer from Spy Game, Dan Mindell, on the show a while back now, and that what you told me about Bob Redford there tracks completely to what he told us as well. Like, his influence was there; he was a director in his own right, and he, you know, gave his advice where he could to improve the film. I think it speaks to the finished product.
Yeah, definitely.
We interrupt this program to bring you a special report.
Calling all agents. Independent podcasting, much like the Spy Game, requires considerable resources, whether it's research, equipment, hosting, or of course constructing a top secret volcano lair. We're putting out the call for your support.
That's right. As you may know, we've activated the Spy Hearts Patreon, home of our ever-growing lineup of Agents in the Field episodes where we decode non-spy films from your favorite spy actors, and full film commentaries with more intel than a Basil exposition briefing.
Cam, what have we got in our crosshairs this month?
The Enforcer and Muscle Beach Party episodes are live, and tune in December. It's going to be plenty of festive fun as we celebrate the holidays Spy Hard style.
And if that sounds delicious, then become a true Spy Hard today and join the circus at patreon.com/spyhards. But before this message self-destructs, Cam, resume the spy jinx. Well, in a galaxy far, far away from James Bond, perhaps one of the other biggest franchises of all time, you've also popped aboard a Star Destroyer, I think, or two, or certainly one. It didn't end well, but yeah, in terms of, we didn't mention Star Wars off the top, but was that an important franchise to you growing up as well?
Yeah, I mean, again, I've never been an obsessive, but came out in '77. I was 3, and yeah, growing up, it meant a great deal to me. The first 3 films, and then I was in my 20s when the prequels came out, and that kind of all the hype and the hype and the hype and then the kind of crushing disappointment. And then I think A Force Awakens I really loved. I was really excited about that. And then to get a chance to be in Rogue One, I mean, I can't remember exactly the order, but it feels like Rogue One was the first sort of spin-off one that wasn't part of the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Is that right? Yeah.
That's right, yeah.
So describing it, I mean, God, I wasn't really allowed to talk about it with anybody, but describing it to people, it was like, well, no, I'm in one that's sort of about the plans to steal the Death Star plans, but it's sort of, it's not part of the main canon type thing. People were like, oh, okay, you know, it sounds a bit like people didn't know what to make of it. And what I say now, I mean, and it's a shorthand and it's a bit lame, but I say, you know, that I was in the kind of the worst of the recent Bond movies, but the best of the recent Star Wars movies. I genuinely think Rogue One is up there with Empire and with I think it's better than any of the other than the Last Jedi or Force Awakens. You know, I think it's great. It makes a really, really strong film. So thrilled to be in it, even with a tiny, tiny part.
It very much has, I think at the time it was seen as a bit of a like novelty movie because it was outside of the regular, you know, Skywalker stories. But generally you tend to see now polls when they ask what's the best of the modern Star Wars era. Rogue One is the one that typically gets mentioned the most. So
yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting how in both Bond and in, you know, Rogue One, you've been featured in movies that were very, you know, reconsidered and reevaluated as the years went past.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I'm pleased with that. Yeah.
It's also interesting to note yours of the Star Wars films is the only one to receive its own sort of show on Disney Plus, because now you've got the Andor show, which is all set before. So technically, your character is still alive.
Great. Thank you for telling me that. I should write to someone, shouldn't I?
So I'm curious, you know, when you talk about getting hired on Bond, I think a lot of people have this, you know, picture of when you go in for a Bond movie, it's this big flashy affair as opposed to, you know, the reality. What was it like going in for Star Wars? Was it similar to the Bond experience?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, kind of the Bond was pre all the NDA stuff that we have to do now. So going in for Rogue One was a process of it was so bizarre, you know. It was kind of a call from agents saying, look, Gina J is casting this movie and we think it's probably the new Star Wars, but she's not allowed to say and we're not allowed to say. And the sides we're going to send you to look at won't be the sides on the day. I mean, of the actual part that you're playing. Also, we can't send you any sides. You'll have to go to Twickenham Studios. And I live in Walthamstow, which is northeast London. So I had to go to southwest London. And I had to sit in a room with someone watching me as I looked at these sides. They were printed on red paper, just in case I would try and photocopy them or photograph them. They wouldn't really come up clearly. So it's black ink on red paper. And I read this, and I had, I think, 20 minutes to learn this scene, literally sit there and learn it. And then I had to go in front of a camera and do it for Gina, who then sent the tape off to Gareth Edwards. And then I think I had a call saying you've been offered it, but they want you to go to Twickenham again to read the scene that you'll actually be doing this time, and it'll be the actual lines, and then you can decide whether or not you want to say yes. I was like, well, okay. So I went all the way to Twickenham. Someone else passed me a piece of paper and stood over me as I read it to make sure I didn't take a photograph of it or anything like that. And that was kind of set the tone for the day, because I did a movie called Assassin's Creed. Well, it was the Assassin's Creed again, which is a little bit better than people say, I think. And there were similar levels of sort of mania around, we must not let the actors actually read the whole script of this in case I don't know what they think we're going to do, you know, try and sell it on eBay, try and flog the secrets to somebody. It's never going to happen. Anyway, even on the day when we were filming Rogue One, we were given our sides on red paper in a kind of miniature form that sat in a lanyard around our neck, a clear plastic lanyard. So we had to carry our lines around with us and have them signed in and signed out at the end of the day. And the journey from the trailer to the set, we had to cover ourselves in black kind of cloaks that covered our heads, because there were drones overhead trying to take pictures, and they didn't want to, you know, let on who was. It was, the levels of secrecy are so absurd. And I have to say, it reaches the point where it wasn't so much the case on Rogue One, because I knew there was never going to be a chance of me to read the whole thing. But on Assassin's Creed, I was doing reshoots because there were problems with the movie and they needed someone to wear a pair of trousers and do some exposition. So it fell to me, as it often does. But no one told me anything about the film. And when they finally sent me the sides, I was literally trying to guess what the whole movie was about and what the plot was. And I ended up turning to one of the extras on set and going, are we goodies, or are we sort of bad guys? Why? I'm putting Michael Fassbender into a thing and I'm picking him up and spinning him around. Why am I doing that to torture him? Am I doing it because he's asked me to? You know what I mean? And the worst thing about the secrecy about modern movie, I had a friend who auditioned for a Marvel movie, and he was trying to get his iPad back into its case, and by mistake he pressed the hold button and the home button at the same time and took a screenshot. And within 10 minutes, he had an email from one of the assistant producers saying, you're not allowed to take screenshots of this script. And within 20 minutes, he had a phone call saying, you are not allowed to take screenshots of the script. He was like, I was trying to put it back in its case. I'm really sorry. I wasn't, you know. So they want us to learn the lines, and they want us to engage as much as we can in the story. But at the same time, they're not telling us what the story is or who we're playing or what the stakes are. You think, look, I'm not a fan. I'm not a kind of, do you know what I mean? I'm not someone who's trying to kind of get anything. I'm literally I'm in this. I'm in the story. I'm trying to be part of the story in order to tell it as effectively as I can. And you're hobbling me by reducing the amount of the world that I can actually see. And you're just shrinking it down to this one scene. And we have this with auditions all the time. We're sent one scene and we have to sort of invent for ourselves the world around it. And we're constantly referring to characters that we don't know about. So it can be quite complicated and quite frustrating to try and kind of do the best you can to convincingly slide into this world, even though you don't know anything about it. So, yeah.
It seems very counterproductive to getting like an organic performance from an actor when you're making them jump through so many hoops just to get to the stage.
Yeah, it can be. And it speaks of a certain lack of trust, you know, and, you know, here are all the serial numbers that you need. You've got to download the app. And then once you've downloaded the app, here are the serial numbers you need to access the script. But you can only open it on one device. So you better decide now if you're going to use your iPad or your phone, because you can't use it. And if you don't look at the screen for more than 30 seconds, it will go blank and you have to put the serial numbers in again. And don't screenshot it and don't print it out. And don't, you know, it's like, well, just you know what I mean? I'm not expecting some benign person to turn up with a freshly printed script, but try not to make it so hard for us, because we're trying to do our best for you and to do the best job we can, and you're just making it harder, you know.
Mm-hmm. And Rogue One famously went through, you know, some reshoots to get to the final form it's in now. When you were working on the movie, did Gareth Edwards shoot all of your material?
Interestingly, no, he didn't. The day I turned up, I was working with this actor Michael Gould, who's playing Admiral Gorin, and Gareth kind of blocked it out, and then he apologized very deeply and said, "Look, I'm really sorry, but this is going to be sort of second unit today, and first unit." He didn't tell me at the time, but it was something Guy Henry was doing as the Peter Cushing legacy character, and they were doing that on another soundstage, and so we were left with the first assistant director, whose name I can't even remember, who essentially directed us. I mean, Gareth had a monitor of what we were doing on our set. And so, and I would get notes back. Oh, Gareth has just watched it and said, blah, blah, blah. But no, he wasn't literally behind the camera on our stuff. And we shot quite a lot more than there was. And I was really disappointed. I mean, I was thrilled to make it into the movie at all, but disappointed that the quite long scene we'd shot had all gone. But, you know, you get used to this in movies, and, you know, it happens all the time. But it was a shame.
Well, I'd be remiss. I mean, obviously, if NDAs are restricting this sort of thing, that's absolutely fine. But of the stuff you did shoot, you say it was a loss to not see it. But could you just sort of talk us through what you did, and we could sort of maybe just fill in our heads?
Yeah, it was, God, I can't remember much of it. But I remember rebel ships kind of appearing out of hyperspace and kind of doing something, but that's impossible. Those are rebel ships. And then I think our ship was sort of being worked on by mechanics or something. So it was like, we've got to leave the ship. We can't. It's being worked on. If we're docked, we're vulnerable. Yeah, but we're not fit. We can't move or something. I think they cut all of that stuff. or the whole idea of it being kind of being unable to move, and then yeah, lots of X-wing attacks. I do remember one of the first times on set that I felt totally thrilled to be on a Star Wars set, was because it was all sort of sinking in. You walk onto the black shiny floors and you're wearing the very, very tight green uniform and all that, and it does get quite exciting. But it wasn't until the first AD said, right, okay, so Rufus, I'm going to have you on your mark there, and then I'll shout action, and then a couple of beats later I'll shout X-wing, and I need you to duck, just hit the floor as soon as you can. I was like, oh my God, someone's literally going to shout. I'm at work, and someone's going to shout the words X-wing, and I have to do something. And that was a moment of real, the little 10-year-old version of me was like, oh my God, that's exciting. But interesting what you say about the reshoots. Sorry, quickly. Alistair Petrie is a good friend of mine who you should do your podcast, and I'm sure would if you asked him.
Yeah.
Who plays the head of the rebels in Rogue One. He's also in Sex Education, and he's in an American show called Deep State, I think. He's great anyway. But he, like me, turns up in a lot of these sorts of films to kind of give information across. And I think he really benefited from the reshoots because they suddenly thought, gosh, there's loads more we need to do with the rebels, planning what they're going to do. And we need a lot more sort of exposition about why they're doing what they're doing. And it fell to Alistair to kind of sell a lot of that story. And he ended up with an absolutely terrific part. And, quite rightly so, has had a great career ever since. But sometimes you go into a movie like that with a smallish part, and then suddenly, because you are in the right story, you're in the storyline that needs beefing up, and you're a character who can effectively kind of clarify things, you end up with a lot more to do, and it's great when that happens,
And I guess your Star Wars journey wasn't over because you ended up doing voices in Battlefront 2 as well after Rogue One.
That's right. Yeah. And I can't remember very much about that because I do quite a lot of video game stuff, and a lot of it is just get down, move, get out, grenade, whatever, and you end up doing a lot of kind of war cries, and then 5 versions of being stabbed, 5 versions of stabbing someone. Can we do a version where you get set on fire and then scream? Can we do a version where you get set on fire and then jump into a river and then feel relief or whatever? I do a lot of that sort of video game work. So yeah, Battlefront was not one I remember particularly well, but it was nice to still be part of the world, I guess.
And with Andor now, there's every chance you could be back.
Yeah,
that's
right. As I say, I need to get busy and start writing letters and saying, look, Casido's not dead yet. Let's find out a little bit more about Lieutenant Casido's early career.
Hey, these days anything can happen. Now, the last film I wanted to tackle is a very recent film, Operation Mincemeat. It's actually a film I really love. I like sort of retellings of history in sort of the spy realm. And also, I quite like the Ian Fleming of that film. I find it quite interesting as well. But but just from your perspective, looking at the past 3 spy roles we've spoken about with Spy Game, with Bond, with Rogue One, they're all fantasy. They're made up. Whereas Operation Mincemeat is fundamentally based off of real life. There's some slight changes, but what was that like, and sort of in comparison to your other roles?
That was a thrill. It was a straight offer, which is always a real pleasure. Please come and play this part. And I play a lot of soldiers on stage and on film. I'm always, partly because of my military background. It was a story I knew a little bit. I don't think I'd seen The Man That Never Was, or I've watched it since. But Ben McIntyre, I love his writing. And Agent Zigzag would make an incredible film. So, yeah, I was thrilled to do it. And we shot it in February 2020, I think, just before COVID, just before lockdown. Very lucky, really. I think it wrapped days before that March, that kind of, that date in March where it all stopped. And I'm enormously proud of the movie, and I'm thrilled that you like it because I think it's a terrific war movie and very clear storytelling. And even though you know the ending, you're kind of rooting for the characters. And John Madden's a wonderful director. And it was the first time I'd ever done that sort of, with Rogue One, it was the whole stage was on a big gimbal, so it was kind of tilting back and forth, which was very exciting. But the submarine scenes we filmed in Twickenham Studios, which is one of the oldest studios in London. It's quite small, really. and I filmed it meters away from where I'd auditioned for Rogue One, and literally meters from where I'd auditioned from Rogue One and other things. So it was great to film. It was great to film that. It was an absolute thrill.
Did you find yourself sort of diving into the backstory of the sort of Operation Mincemeat story, or did you just sort of just do the role, as it were?
Yeah, no, I did. I mean, it's always a question, I think, for actors about how much research they do. And for me, it's always a question of doing all the research I can and then constantly going back to the text. Because if you find something in your research which clashes with the text, then you're sort of in trouble, because you can't really change the text. If it's a new piece of writing, either on stage or on film, you can maybe approach the writer and go, well, I'm not sure about what you've written here, because it turns out that he had an obsession with this, or blah, blah, blah. So I read the book of Operation Mincemeat, obviously, and then I found out as much as I could about Bill Jewell, who I was playing. And funnily enough, his great grandson or granddaughter reached out to me on Instagram and said, "Oh, you're playing I don't know how she found out, but you're playing my great grandfather. He was a wonderful man," and blah, blah, blah. And it was clear that everyone had a lot of affection for this man. And he was a fascinating character as well, Bill Jewell himself. So, yeah, for me, it's all about doing any research that I find interesting and sort of fun, and I think will inform what I'm doing. But at the same time, always going back to the text. And if it clashes, kind of reconciling that with myself and thinking, well, I can't, I've just got to do the best I can with it. Yeah.
Is there a lot of responsibility when you're going in to play a real person like that? And how do you kind of liberate yourself from that responsibility to just, tackle the role?
There is, yeah. And I mean, I've played characters who it's always important as an actor not to have an attitude towards the character you're playing, because no one really thinks they're a bad guy type thing. Do you know what I mean? I mean, I've played David Cameron and Tony Blair in this play, The Audience, with Helen Mirren, in the West End and on Broadway. And I quite like Blair and I can't stand Cameron, but it's no good me thinking, oh, well, this is my attitude. You can't have an attitude towards the person you're playing. You only ever play the truth and how you feel. So, but it's a huge sense of responsibility when you're playing someone. In a way, there's more responsibility when you're playing someone who's never really been depicted on screen before. I mean, I suppose in The Man Who Never Was, Bill Jewell was depicted, but no one else knows who Bill Jewell is. Do you know what I mean? He was just a naval officer in the war who happened to have appeared in this kind of extraordinary story. So I knew very well that all the generations that followed him would be watching, his family would be watching and thinking, oh, how are they going to portray Grandfather Bill? So that is a responsibility. And yeah, I mean, you do the research you can, and you try not to take an attitude towards the character you're playing, but you're aware that it might have some sort of, that there's always going to be freight, there's always going to be weight attached to what you're doing.
I mean, I agree personally. We've had Ben McIntyre on the show. I'm a big fan of his book, and he's another spy show coming out soon that I quite enjoyed, which is coming soon. But let's just sort of as we wrap up now, the question, because you've got so many spy characters you've tackled, I need to ask you, who would win in a fight? Between, you've got your spy game, Bond, you've got Rogue One, you've got Operation Mincemeat. Put them four in a fight. Who's going to be the best spy?
God, who's up in the fight?
Was it basically all of your characters you've played? So
all the characters I've played, obviously. Yeah. Wow. God. Well, spy game would get nowhere. He was just a kind of pen pusher, wasn't he? Really. I like to think Lieutenant Casino had a backstory, but with only one line, we'll never really know how much of a backbone he had. The Treasury agent, I think, was more of a sort of policy wonk, really, so I think it would have to be Bill Jewell, because he was a proper Second World War naval officer with a roll neck and a sassy attitude. Yeah, so Bill Jewell would kick all their asses, I think, probably.
I love it. It's a good answer. That's what I would have picked. And then just one thing we'd like to ask when we have actors on the show. Is there something from your back catalogue, from your filmography, that you think people should go and check out? It could be sort of recorded stage work you've done, or films, TV, something that didn't get the love you think it deserved.
Yes, the job that I'm proudest of, I think, of the last few years was a BBC PBS co-production called 8 Days to the Moon and Back. That was a 50th anniversary of Apollo 11, and it was a sort of drama doc reconstruction of the Apollo 11 moon landing, and it was made on an absolute shoestring by the BBC Science Unit. And it's an hour and a half long kind of TV movie. And it ended up getting a BAFTA nomination, an Emmy nomination, a Rose d'Or nomination. And, you know, it was feted all over the world. And it's a beautiful, beautiful film. We basically lip synced to the original audio from the Apollo 11 space mission. So I played Neil Armstrong and I got to say, you know, one small step for man, all that sort of thing. But they cut it with all the archive footage from Mission Control and all Walter Cronkite giving the TV coverage and all that sort of thing. It occasionally pops up on iPlayer because they show it quite a lot on the BBC. But you can get it on Prime as well, I think. But it's part of a kind of 50th anniversary moon landing package. But I became kind of obsessed with the moon landings afterwards and fascinated by the energy and courage and resourcefulness of those men and women who got man on the moon. It was just breathtaking.
I'm just looking at a picture of you in the capsule.
Oh, there we go. Yeah.
Yeah, good shot there. Yeah, we'll put a link to that in the show notes below so everyone can go check that out.
Great.
And so what are you working on currently? What's going on with you?
I've had a kind of theatre year, really. I did a play called The Corn is Green at the National Theatre with Nicola Walker, which was a play about Welsh coal mining community, and then followed immediately by Much Ado About Nothing, which I played Leonardo. So that was fantastic, and that finished in September. I've done a little bit on Endeavour, you know, the detective drama, and waiting to hear about one or two other things which may happen before the end of this year or at the beginning of next year. But I've flipped to my other career, which is as a painter, portrait painter. And if you put a link to my Instagram, I would be grateful, which is at Rufus G. Wright, in which you can see my my work as a portrait artist, which is keeping me quite busy as well.
Consider it done.
Yep.
Consider it done. Well, the final question we have for you, and everyone has been asked this from John Glenn to Nicholas Meyer, everyone on the show. Rufus Wright, what is your favorite spy movie of all time? Now,
it's a really hard question to ask, and I'm going to slightly cheat.
That's fine. You will not be the first.
Well, a really old one, and I know you've talked about, a really old one and a very recent one. One is 39 Steps. And I know, actually, I listened to a bit of your coverage of the 50s remake of 39 Steps, but I'm talking about the 30s one. I played Hannah in the West End adaptation of the 39 Steps, which is more of an adaptation of the film than of the book.
Right.
But loved playing Hannah and loved the Donut film, just gorgeous. And the recent one is, and again, I think you've spoken to Dominic Cook, who directed The Corn is Green, the play at the National. But The Courier, I think, is a fantastic movie.
Yeah.
And I'm a big fan of spy movies that are about ordinary, it's usually men, let's face it. It'd be nice if it was more women, but Cumberbatch playing, you know, a salesman who ends up being a spy. And that's as engaging, I think, as the highly trained, you know, Walther PPK, you know, kind of ruthless assassin. I think the guy who sort of ends up doing it because he gets a hand on the shoulder in his club and then ends up, you know, becoming a fully fledged spy is as much of an interesting story, if not more so. And I think The Courier handles that sort of aspect of the spy world brilliantly. The kind of the poor nebbish guy who had no idea what he was getting himself into and then ends up in a gulag, you know, and all of that. And I think it's brilliant.
I mean, it's a harrowing performance from Benedict, and I think, you know, people always think they want to be James Bond, and of course you'd want to be James Bond, but you're more likely to be Benedict Cumberbatch's character from The Courier because you're just a normal bloke or woman doing your life, and then someone makes you a spy all of a sudden, and that's I think far more interesting.
Exactly, because it could happen to any of us, and I think all of us have had those fantasies where we think, gosh, maybe it'll be me, maybe I'll get the hand on the shoulder, and someone will say, you know, you're the man. Scott, we need you now. We need you to go to Moscow and ring from the.
It sounds official when you say it. Actually, there's like an air of importance in your voice there. I like it.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's us. we could do this for hours because you've got so many films that we could talk about, and there's so much more we could dive into. But it's always interesting to hear from someone who was in the film we're talking about of the week, which was Quantum. So thank you, Rufus, for your time. We'll put links to, of course, your Instagram in the show notes below, as well as the movie you mentioned as well. But ladies and gentlemen, thank you, Mr. Rufus Wright.
Thank you very much indeed, guys. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
No, the pleasure's been all ours. Thank you so much.
And we're back. That was our chat with Mr. Rufus Wright. Rufus, again, want to thank you for your time. It was a wonderful chat and lovely to hear some insights about a film that, as we said earlier in the week, I think deserves a little bit of a reappraisal.
Definitely. And I thought it was really interesting to talk to someone who plays kind of a utility scene, explaining exposition to, Bond and M at MI6 and getting kind of an inside look at the kinds of scenes you don't hear talked about. Like when you talk to people generally about Bond movies, they're going to talk about, like, say, the bungee jump in Goldeneye or something like that. And what I really found interesting was sort of more of the examination of kind of the, character-driven information scenes that, let's be honest, they make up a huge section of Bond movies.
And a very large portion of Quantum of Solace, because all it really has is action sequences and exposition sequences that really get you through the film. So it's a hard task to ask someone to come in and deliver this, with meaning. I think he does a good job in the film, and we sort of detailed that in the interview where, an actor turns up and really has to bring life to what is basically, this is what happened. You need to go here and do that.
Yeah, and there's that old saying, very old saying, there's no small parts, only small actors. And that you can bring life to any moment. Because, we've all watched movies where, like a small character actor part really pops and everyone walks out and goes, who was that guy? Like, it really stands out in that moment. And, like, I think that's something the Bond movies traditionally do really, really well, which is populate the entire cast with memorable faces and character types. And I just thought this was really interesting to hear from someone who, just from the process of getting hired, shooting with, like, a legendary actress like Dame Judi Dench. I thought his whole story was really interesting and not the type of Bond story that, I think fans are used to hearing over and over again.
No, absolutely. It's nice to have a different perspective and a different voice from the Bond sort of list of actors that have been in sort of, or Bond royalty, I suppose you would call them. And I was also quite interested to hear about the mechanics of the digital board that he had to deal with. I know it's all quite blink and you'll miss it in a way, but nowadays that's very easy to show, and there's all sorts of technology that you'd have, like the screens you can interact with. But this was shot in 2008, 2007. That technology was there, but it was exceedingly expensive. So this had to have been done post-production, which is, we confirmed it was. So he had to memorize like a hand maneuver, and you hear that he's like practicing it the night before. That's very old school cinema of like putting things together. It was just nice to hear what went into it.
Yeah, and Rufus has a pretty extensive theater background. And so I think like a lot of that sort of skill set would go into pulling off a moment like this and making it look effortless. Plus, apparently the card magic, I would imagine the sleight of hand would be quite handy in pulling off this sort of sequence.
Yeah, it's a shame we're an audio podcast sometimes, because maybe releasing the video would have been quite fun if he'd done a card trick as well. It would have been quite cool to see. And, speaking about the guy's other spy credentials, got a little chat in there about Spy Game, and it's nice to have another voice on one of our favorite spy films. Obviously, we tackled that a while back with friend of the show, Chris Carr, and had Dan Mindell, the cinematographer, on for an interview for the film as well. So yeah, talking about working with Robert Redford and a very fun impression of Tony Scott there. I didn't think I'd ever hear that on the show.
Yeah, that was a lot of fun. And Tony Scott was such a legendary character. It's fun to hear that, like, that was very much the case for those who actually worked with him. And it's not just kind of the stories passed from person to person to the point where they become kind of misconstrued.
Absolutely. But, in terms of, I think it was his first major motion picture. What a crucible to go through, but what a great sort of learning tree to sit under as well. Tony Scott, someone like Dan Mindell around, Robert Redford, even Brad Pitt as well. I don't think they were ever together, but certainly Bob Redford was, and a great way for an actor to learn the ropes.
Yeah, for sure. And I was really interested to hear about his just journey into doing a Star Wars movie, because there's such a weird relationship between, Bond and Star Wars. likely because of the fact they both shot at Pinewood over extended periods. So you would have this kind of intermingling of character actors sometimes, and typically the histories are kind of linked in a lot of ways. And so I was really interested to hear him just talk about the process of um, getting the gig, but also just like all of the complications in terms of the absolute terror of any secrets of the movie leaking out. That's such a modern thing. In 1977, when they were shooting the original Star Wars, these were not concerns that actors had to go through.
No, and you know, I was when I was hearing Rufus talk about that, I was taken back to sort of hearing about the production of Tenet and hearing about the cast being locked in a room, having to read the script and then being thrown out the room with no script and having to sort of. I think I can't remember, one of the actors in the film said he had to read it 4 times to get his head round it, and then wasn't allowed to read it again. I mean, I understand the secrecy, and yeah, Rufus even said they were like flying drones overhead trying to get shots of them making Rogue One. I understand the secrecy and the protectiveness of Disney, but there's certainly a cold element to it, and whereas acting is quite a human thing, it's the exploring of emotions and displaying emotions to put a story across and to sell something, I suppose. But to have that sort of stripped away, because you can't find out any more about the film because you're only getting your lines, and you can't really even sort of study your lines. You just get them flashed and you get to quickly learn them. There's no like introspection as to what your motivation is. You just have to kind of wing it. And I'm not going to make some sort of pithy sort of hypothesis, but you know, we're looking at Hollywood now that's basically all franchises and sequels. It's like sort of homogenized in a way sometimes, and I wonder if that's part of the reason why.
Yeah, I would think that's a part of the reason for sure. Yeah, and it is interesting just how like the concept of like working in these types of movies was so different at a time. Now we live in a world where like that is the primary source of work for like, good money. And so a lot of actors are out there, like Rufus, who's doing like great theater work, independent films. I think he was in the movie 45 Years. And then, stuff like Star Wars and Bond are great gigs to get. But when you hear about the experiences, as fun as they can be or as rewarding as they can be, they don't have the freedom that some of these other jobs have.
Well, you think about Christian Bale recently being in Thor: Love and Thunder and sort of talking about the harrowing experiences he went through filming that, basically acting against nothing, and what Gore the God Butcher has to sort of put across in that film, like the loss he suffers and things like that. Whereas it's just Christian Bale acting into the ether. And I can only imagine that is exceedingly tough. And it actually all connects back quite nicely to Bond in a way, because you think back to Jacqueline Bisset, who we had on the show for Casino Royale 67. She spoke about how Peter Sellers left her for her close-up shots, and she had to read across from, I don't know, one of the ADs, probably something like that. And she took that as a lesson to her going forward in her career, to never let any of her actors that she's shooting with read by themselves, and to always be there to read against and to give them lines even though they're off screen and don't necessarily have to be there. And yeah, it's fun how this all connects.
I was hearing an anecdote recently too about like Jack Nicholson when they were doing A Few Good Men, and he's on the stand and he gives, that big fiery speech, right? We all remember it. And he proceeded to do it for all the other actors for their moments. And at a certain point, I can't remember if it was the director or someone else said to Jack Nicholson, like, you don't have to do this. We can cover it without you. And he was like, hey, it's acting. It's what I love doing.
And it's one of the finest courtroom dramas ever created. So I'm glad he did it, to be fair. But yeah, and obviously Rufus popped up in Operation Mincemeat recently, which I know is a film you've not seen, Cam, but we did a declassified episode. It was myself and previous guest of the show, Tom Butler, covered it. I think it was around about the summertime or late spring earlier on this year. And we had a lot of fun with that film. So it was interesting to talk to Rufus about it because he plays quite a central role in the film, and sort of the differences between working from a real life character, sort of doing adaptation of that, against working for more fictional characters we did with Spy Game, Star Wars, Bond, etc. And yeah, his preferences really. So that was fun to talk about.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to covering that movie on the actual show, doing it like as a proper review episode, because that was a bummer case where it opened in theaters for you guys, over in the UK, but here it was like several months later where it was finally going to be just a Netflix film.
Yeah, it's definitely out there now, but yeah, we're holding on to watch it together down the road when we pick up on that. But overall, I think it was a really insightful interview. It's always nice to hear from people that were part of the sort of Bond legacy. And, as we sort of explore Quantum of Solace in this interview and the next one, it's always nice to hear different perspectives.
Yeah, for sure. This was a ton of fun, too. And very great stories, like just a genuine energy. And, Rufus was a fantastic storyteller.
Absolutely. So I guess, Cam, the question is, what are we doing next time?
Well, Scott, we have another SpyMaster interview tackling another aspect of Quantum of Solace. We are going to talk to director of photography, Roberto Schaefer, about lensing this movie and giving it its really visually distinct style.
Yeah, we spoke a lot about the visuals in the review earlier this week with David Zaritsky. If you haven't checked that out yet, I suggest heading over there as well. But your mission, should you choose to accept it, is to check out our Roberto Schaefer interview next Tuesday. We're going to go deep into Quantum of Solace and how they made it look the way it does, dealing with the production issues and all that sort of stuff. So it's a really fascinating interview. I suggest if you enjoyed this, catch up with that as well. If you like what you heard on the show, please consider leaving us a 5-star review wherever you get your podcasts, and do not forget to follow us discreetly on social media at SpyHards. That's SpyHards. But until next time, listeners, just remember, Tosca, it's not for everyone.